If you want to do a little extra Bible study on this morning's text, jot down Isaiah chapter 63. Isaiah chapter 63. And you'll see that Paul was drawing on an Old Testament text when he spoke about grieving the Holy Spirit. But the discussion there is a little bit different. I'll let you go away and look at that. If you have any questions, come back and I would be happy to talk to you about it. Tonight, we're still reading in Revelation chapter 19. Every time we come to chapter 19, we need to back up to verse 11 to kind of get a running start to get in context. We've only got a few verses left to actually talk about, but I just want to read these verses that we've already looked at to get ourselves back in the mood, so to speak, of what's happening here in Revelation chapter 19. Verse 11. This, of course, is John the Apostle speaking because he's the one who received the vision on the Isle of Patmos. He says, I saw the heaven standing open, and look, a white horse, and the one sitting on it was called Faithful and True, and with righteousness he judges and makes war. His eyes were like flaming fire, and on his head was many diadems, having a name written which no one knows except himself, and dressed in a garment dipped in blood, and his name is called the Word of God. And the armies of heaven followed after him on white horses, dressed in pure white linen. And from his mouth proceeds a sharp or swift sword, either will do, so that by it he might strike the nations, and he himself will shepherd them with a rod of iron. And he himself treads the winepress of the fury or the furious anger of God Almighty. And he has on his garment and on his thigh a name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. So here's the appearance of Jesus Christ at his second coming, riding the white horse, ready for war, rather than riding the donkey into Jerusalem as an advocate of peace. Verse 17, and I saw one angel standing in the sun, and he cried out with a loud voice, saying to all of the birds flying in midair, come and gather for the supper, the great supper of God. Now here's a contrast. There's another supper mentioned earlier in chapter 19. Does anybody remember, who remembers what that is? Okay, the wedding feast or the wedding supper of the Lamb is taking place in some other undisclosed location, but at the same time we have this contrast on earth, which is not unusual in the book of Revelation. Often there are contrasts of this nature. Verse 18, so that you might eat the flesh of kings, the flesh of commanders, the flesh of strong, the flesh of horses and those sitting upon them, and the flesh of all those who are free and slaves, both great, both small and great. So this is a picture that's common in the Old Testament of battle. Because usually after a battle there would be so many corpses that they couldn't be cleaned up in time to keep the birds and other scavengers from cleaning up. Verse 19. This is where we left off. And I saw the beast and the kings of the earth and their armies gathered to make war with the one sitting on the horse and with his armies. Now, nowhere does it say that the one sitting on the white horse is Jesus, but we know that from our reading of the book of Revelation, that this is his appearance. He gets these descriptions of his glory that are unique in the book of Revelation. The first one was early in chapter 1. So he is the one making war with the beast. And we remember from chapter 13, that is the Antichrist. So here's the final conflict between Christ and Antichrist. Verse 20, it says that the beast was snatched up with the false prophet, the one making signs before him, and with them leading astray all of those who took the mark of the beast and those worshiping his icon or his image, and they were thrown living, both of them, into the lake of fire burning with sulfur, and the rest were killed by the sword coming out of the one sitting upon the horse, coming out of his mouth, and all of the birds were gorged with their flesh. So there's this big build-up for the battle, and then what happens? There's no battle. The armies that follow Christ don't even engage. It's hard to know exactly what's going on here because of the imagery, but whatever it is, it's decisive, and it happens quickly. And again, as I said, the armies that are following behind Jesus never engage in any violence. The Lord is the one who reserves all of that to himself. What else do you see there that catches your attention?
No, sir.
Pardon me?
Well, missing the dragon.
Missing what?
The dragon.
Right. We haven't gotten to Satan yet. No, Satan, I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. So Satan is still on the loose, and we're going to find out in chapter 20 what happens to him. But all of those who have followed him now have been dealt with decisively. The Antichrist, the false prophet, and this is the first mention of this lake of fire. We have all of these descriptions, many of them from Jesus, about the judgment that comes in eternity. Can you think of those that Jesus used in his parables? How did he describe this place of judgment? Weeping and gnashing of teeth. What else? The outer darkness. Okay, yeah. Weeping and gnashing of teeth, trembling, the outer darkness. Their worm never dies. So they're all very negative descriptions. Yes, sir.
When Jesus was saying those things, was he talking about this, or was he talking about death?
This is hell. The second death. We'll find at the end of chapter 20 that death itself is thrown into the lake of fire and conquered completely. Death is the enemy. I was reading something recently. Oh, I know what it was. Travis's good friend, Joey Dotson, some of you remember him, has continued to have a rather stellar professional career. He's moved from university to university and so forth, and he's recently edited a book with essays in it that compare the teaching in the New Testament, particularly Paul, to great Greek philosophers. And each of the writers points out the comparisons and the contrasts between ancient Greek philosophy and the Christian doctrine from the first century. It's a fascinating book. I love reading stuff like that. I can kind of tell by the look on your face that there's few of you out there that would want to read that book. That's okay. If you do want to, come and ask me, and I'll help you get a copy of it.
C.S. Lewis kind of wrote about that too.
He did, and there's a reason for that, because skeptics have tried to make the case that Christianity is nothing more than rehashed Greek philosophy, and that all of the ideas that are expressed by Paul, Peter, and others in the first century were really already floating around. They just gathered them up and put them together, maybe in a slightly unique way, but there's nothing new. So, as is always the case in scholarship, Christian scholars were forced to go back and come up with an apologetic for that. First of all, you have to go back and find out what the truth is and read the documents. But people like Joey Dodson likes ancient Greek philosophy, and so guys like him are already very familiar with it. They read it in the original Greek language, and they love it. So they're ready to point out that yes, there are some comparisons between the New Testament and some Greek philosophy, but there are fundamental differences. There are fundamental differences as well. And I I have completely forgotten what the original question was at this point, so I always need to ask y'all for my help. What were we talking about? Hell. So we went from hell to Greek philosophy.
Yes, you did. Pretty close to that.
Yeah. I'll have to watch the tape later on and find out how that happened. What's that? Well, it'll come back to me at some point, but at any rate, these descriptions of hell, which are so unsettling and disconcerting to modern Westerners, are surprisingly almost always in the New Testament on the lips of Jesus Christ. Some people get the feeling that the whole Bible is full of this kind of language, and you certainly can find language about judgment in other places. But this really personal, eternal hell that we know about was a revelation in many ways of Jesus. Jack?
You're going back to Dante's Inferno. A lot of people, that's how they draw their picture of hell.
Right. And even with Jesus' rhetoric, it's hard to know exactly what he's talking about, but there's one thing that is perfectly clear. It's not good. You know, it's a place of being separated from God and His love. Now, let's remind ourselves that as we read chapter 19, we're just kind of jumping in the middle here tonight, but there are 18 other chapters before this. And those of you that have been here for all of those 18 chapters are aware that God has reached out over and over and over again, and his efforts to get people to repent have become increasingly intense as time goes on, and then finally the time runs out. I always think of the Noah and the ark at this point. You know, God's patience is long. And he makes many, many attempts, but at some point he respects the decision of those who want nothing to do with him and moves on with his plan. So here's Armageddon. A little bit of a disappointment maybe for those who have seen the movies about it because it's over in a flash. There's another thing that we need to talk about before we move to chapter 20 though. This battle, notice that the word Armageddon is not mentioned anywhere here in chapter 19. We get the word Armageddon from earlier in the book of Revelation when we were going through the bowls. The sixth bowl mentions Armageddon. When that bowl was poured out by the angel, the river Euphrates was dried up so that the kings of the east could come and prepare for this battle, this anticlimactic battle that we just read about in chapter 19. But there's more than that. If we go back to the seals, remember that's the first cycle, seals, trumpets, bowls. If we go back to the sixth seal in chapter 9 of the book of Revelation, it talks about 4 angels doing something at the river Euphrates to allow an army to prepare for this battle. And the army is remarkable for its size. Who remembers how many soldiers are in the army? 200 million is what is mentioned there. That itself is an interesting number because when John was writing these words in the first century, the idea of an army of 200 million was ludicrous. Populations in individual nations would allow for it. And so it would just seem like a symbolic number for something big. But now we see that would actually be literally possible to put together something like that. But here's the interesting thing is that in the seals, the Euphrates is mentioned, the 200 million army is mentioned, but that's way back earlier in the book. And it says that a third of humanity was killed at that point. And then we roll along to chapter 14 and we read about the winepress and the wrath of anger and this river of blood that's almost 200 miles long up to the bridles of horses. And then we come to chapter 16 in the sixth bowl. Again, Armageddon is mentioned. Now, if we're trying to put a chronological sequence of all of the events together in the book of Revelation, there may be a clue here in the fact that this battle, which seems to be a reference to the same conflict in all four places, is mentioned in four different places. And that would seem to support the idea that there's recapitulation going on in the book of Revelation. We've talked about that several times, that the book of Revelation is telling the same story over and over again from different perspectives, and it keeps starting over again. Otherwise, what you have is several references to the same battle, but they seem to be different battles. So it's kind of it's something you have to stop and think and ponder about, and we're about to run into it again here in chapter 20. Any other questions about this description of Armageddon before we move to chapter 20? Yes, ma'am.
I was wondering, because it says, the beast and the ones that worship the image of the beast and the ones that have the mark of the beast are going to be thrown into the fire, but then it says, and the rest of them. So who are the rest of them?
Well, the others who are living on earth, presumably.
That just don't have anything to do with the beast? But
Well, that's a good question, and John doesn't answer it. And what we're going to run into here in chapter 19 and 20 are several questions exactly like that are really unanswerable from the text. There are groups that we're not really sure what happens to them. That wasn't his concern. But that's a good question. Anybody else on chapter 19? Jennifer, people have come up with a lot of different answers to that. And if you want to read about it, I'll give you some reading materials, because there are different ideas about how to account for that. Something fascinating happens here in chapter 20. Let's read it together and talk about it. I'm sorry, we have another one?
Well, just about before we move on. So basically what you're saying with the recapitulation theory is, this didn't really happen in the blink of an eye.
Didn't have to what?
This didn't really happen in the blink of an eye. This just seems to be over as soon as it starts. But if those other sections we're talking about battle,
Then there's more to it.
this one too. Yeah.
That's right. And again, we can argue both sides, but we can never we've never finished the argument until the events unfold, because John didn't bother to give us a marker, so to speak, that would solve the quandary. It looks he seems to be using recapitulation all over the place, but it's hard to then, when you get into the details, to figure out exactly how he's putting it together. So people have different ideas of how to do it. This is already a long vision, 22 chapters. And if John were to start answering all the questions that we have, stop and think about this. If John were to start to try to answer all of the questions that have been asked about the book of Revelation, imagine how it would blossom in size. It would be huge. And so when you take these kinds of events and visions and revelations and you squeeze them down into 22 chapters, there's going to be some questions about details.
Do visions usually have every little detail?
I'm sorry?
Do visions usually have every little detail?
No, they don't. So, and that's one of the frustrations that people have with reading the Bible is the brevity that God often uses when He communicates. It leaves some questions unanswered. And at some point you have to go to Deuteronomy 29:29 and say that the secret things belong to the Lord our God, that the things revealed belong to us, so that we can do what we know we need to. My translation. Jack, did you have your hand up?
I was just thinking, to the 21st century era, and we're talking about a battle with horses, and we're talking about technology of the military. It's hard to imagine that in the future we're going to go back to horse.
Yeah, good question. But horses are still used. Horses were used as recently as the first and the beginning of the Second World War. And there could be things that would require horses. In fact, horses were used in the Iraq War, simply because, horses alongside with helicopters, because there were places in Afghanistan. I said Iraq, but I'm thinking Afghanistan. When we started the hostilities after September the 11th in Afghanistan, the geography demands that if you're on the ground, there are places you pretty much can't move around unless you're on a horse. And so there are still times when horses are used. Of course, this is speaking of a huge army. So unanswerable question, but an interesting question. Any others on chapter 19? Let's look at chapter 20. It says, "And I saw an angel coming down from heaven, having the key to the abyss and a large chain in his hand. And he seized the dragon." So here is, remember, the dragon is symbolic for Satan. Here's Satan. And in case we're wondering about that, he makes it clear. So he seized the dragon, the ancient serpent, who is Diabolos, the devil, and Satan, and he bound him for 1,000 years. And he placed him in the abyss and locked and sealed it over him so that he might not lead astray nations until the end of the 1,000 years. After these things, it is necessary for him to be released for a short time. Now, these are without a doubt some of the most controversial verses in the entire Bible. What to do with this 1,000 years. One of the reasons that they are controversial and fought over is that nowhere else in the New Testament is this 1,000 years mentioned directly. Nowhere else in the Bible is it mentioned directly, although a lot of people believe, and I'm among them, that in Isaiah we read about this period of time is just not defined as the 1,000 years. So this is sort of the cutting board here for what people think about the book of Revelation. When we come to these verses, we divide everybody up immediately into three groups. And some of you probably are already aware of this. Can anybody tell me what those three groups are? Did I hear
Millennial.
Amillennial, yeah.
Post-millennial.
Postmillennial, and premillennial. It's logical. It's logical the way that the division happens here because those are the kind of logical possibilities in dealing with this 1,000 years. Let's take the amillennial first. And usually when you put the word a in front of a word, what does it do to the words?
Cancels it out.
Yeah, just like the letters UN. We could call amillennialist unmillennialist. Like the uncola. I don't know why that jumped into my mind. Some of you remember that. But amillennialists, generally speaking, don't believe that there is any kind of literal 1,000 years that's being prophesied here, that the 1,000 years are symbolic. No surprise there, because anywhere we put our foot down in the book of Revelation, whatever we're looking at, somebody's going to say, there's going to be an argument about whether it's literal or symbolic. And that'll probably go on because, without a doubt, there's a lot of symbolism. So it's hard to know where to draw that line. So the amillennialist says, well, we've already finished everything up. We've got the beast and the false prophet is in the lake of fire, and we've had Armageddon. It's time to move on to heaven. So what is this whole millennial thing? Must be another recapitulation. And this is where some people, I believe, have gone too far with the idea of recapitulation. They believe that this 1,000 years is just another symbolic representation of everything that we've already read in the book of Revelation. In other words, that the 1,000 years is an undetermined period of time between the first coming of Jesus Christ and the second coming of Jesus Christ. And then there's a variety of all-millennialists about what they think about what is supposed to happen between those two periods. Now, look at this text again, and I think there's something obvious here that keeps us from believing in all-millennialism. Look at those three verses. "And I saw an angel coming down from heaven, having the key of the abyss and a large chain in his hand, and he snatched the dragon, the ancient serpent, the one who's called the devil and Satan, and he bound him for 1,000 years. He put him in the abyss, locked and sealed it over him, so that he cannot lead the nations astray until the end of the 1,000 years." So what is the problem with believing that the 1,000 years is a representation of the time between the first and second coming of Jesus Christ.
We're already past 2,000.
Well, but they don't believe it's a literal 1,000 years, Jack. It could be 10,000 years, and it still would be the 1,000 years. So we can throw that out. What'd you say? Okay, there's something else here in these three verses.
Satan's still loose.
Yeah, that's it. Do we live in a world now where Satan is bound and he's not leading the nation astray? I don't think so. And most Christians would agree with that. And so that's a fundamental problem with the amillennialist position. What they believe, how would they deal with this? Use your imagination for just a minute and pretend you're an amillennialist. How do you account for the fact that Satan is bound right now? Can you? In any way whatsoever?
You're blaming your evil human nature.
Okay, we're blaming what's happening on the devil. He really has nothing to do with it.
Can't see him.
Can't see him.
Well, it doesn't mean he doesn't have demons or things are doing it for him.
Okay. Anybody else? I wouldn't expect you to know this. I was just curious to know how you would handle it.
Could it be that his, the other fallen angels that came with him? Or-
Okay, so he's bound, but his angels are busy without him.
I think they're already.
She doesn't even like romance, right? I can tell by the look on her face.
They think they're perfect. They think David's talking to perfect.
Y'all aren't going to think of it because you wouldn't. Because I think it's kind of crazy sounding. Here's how the amillennialists would answer that. They would say that when Jesus was crucified, that's when Satan was bound and thrown into the abyss. Okay, so far so good. And the reason that there's still evil in the world is because he may have some slack that has been taken up a little bit. He's a little more controlled than he was. I like the look on your face. It doesn't make any sense. So that's an effort to try to hold on to a position that they find more comfortable in the rest of the book. Because the rest of the book for them is just a bunch of symbols about the struggle between good and evil that don't have to be taken with any kind of literalness whatsoever. Paul?
It's a little off the subject. Is the abyss the same as the lake of fire?
No, the abyss was mentioned in chapter 9. If you go back and look at the beginning of chapter 9, the abyss was cracked open for just a moment. A lot of evil things came out of it. It's a bad place. It's also mentioned in Jesus' ministry. Remember the legion of demons that were in the gentleman that lived out in the cemetery? That there's an implication there that he was going to send them back to the abyss, which may be the same place. So, amillennialism doesn't really entice me at all. I think there are a lot of problems with it. Let's talk about post-millennialism. Who knows what post-millennialism teaches?
Millennium is already over.
Postmillennialism teaches that Jesus will come back at the end of the 1,000-year period. So this is all has to do with this 1,000 years we just read about. And where does it fit into God's scheme? The amillennialist says that the 1,000 years is the period of time between Jesus' first and second coming, and that it's not literal, and that Satan is bound now. The post-millennialist says that Jesus comes at the end of the 1,000 years. Okay? That this 1,000 years, and we'll read in just a moment, it's 1,000 years that at least up until the very end is filled with righteous rule. Things go on earth as they're supposed to. And so the post-millennialist is optimistic about human history. Post-millennialist believes that Christianity will have such a positive effect on human history that we will eventually reach a point where most of the evils in the world have been brought to bay. Maybe not completely erased, but brought down to a bare minimum. Hunger will be wiped out, racism will be wiped out, hatred, war, all of that, that most of the world will embrace Christianity and learn to live the ethic of love as it's described in the Bible. And then, after 1,000 years of that, Jesus comes back. All right? So what might be the problem with a post-millennial view?
Certainly gives thought. I would think.
The 1,000-year reign is with Christ.
Christ.
Okay. That's part of the problem. That's a good insight, David. There's a historical problem.
Things are getting worse.
Now, the humanists would agree with the postmillennialists in general that we can be optimistic about the future of humanity. Not for the same reasons, obviously. The humanist thinks that humanity has within itself to eventually pull ourselves up and do better, unless they're a nihilist and they're just negative. But what does history tell us? What is the testimony of history so far?
As Lincoln said, things aren't getting better, they're getting worse.
They really aren't. You know, if you look at the last 100 years, and if you just stretch it back just a little bit, since we're now at the end of 100 years after World War I, because World War I was a turning point in human history. And if you study the writings of thinkers in the West and elsewhere, there was a pall came over the vision for the future after World War I. World War I brought images into people's living rooms that were horrific, that were unimaginable. For us as citizens of the United States, the big conflict before World War I was what? It was the Civil War. You know, the Civil War was pretty awful. Tens of thousands of people would go out onto a big field and just butcher each other for hours. When it was all over, 20 or 30,000 people, men, would be dead. But that was nothing compared to what people saw with World War I. Now we saw airplanes dropping bombs and mustard gas and tanks, and the capability of butchery that even surpassed what was happening in the Civil War. And then to make things even worse, the leaders of the world botched what many saw as an opportunity to chart a path toward world peace after World War I. Woodrow Wilson and others, they wanted a League of Nations, and they thought that the horrors of World War I would once and for all convince citizens of the earth that we've got to do something different, or the outcome is going to be absolutely disastrous. Jack?
That's why they call it the war to end all wars.
The war to end all wars, but it didn't. It unleashed horrors that were even worse, unfortunately, both politically and militarily. Then we come to World War II, and a lot of terrible things happened there as well. But the one that stands out more than any other is what? We have nuclear weapons. Now we can see the actual possibility of maybe really wiping out life on Earth, or at least life as we know it. And so a nihilism, or nihilism, depending on how you pronounce it, began to show itself in the latter half of the 20th century, a skepticism, a cynicism that I believe impacted our culture dramatically. And we're still seeing the changes from the impact. Every generation that has lived since World War II has lived with the thought that the world literally may be destroyed during their lifetime. And that has really changed people's outlook. You know, there are still optimistic people around. There's still people who think that technology can catapult us into a new world. But now we have this new thing called AI. What's that stand for? Artificial intelligence. And that's brought another wave of both optimism and pessimism. The great physicist in England that just died recently, who was stuck in his wheelchair, Stephen Hawking, warned against artificial intelligence. And a lot of people are too. I'm not quite as pessimistic about artificial intelligence, but I am pessimistic about the human race's ability to put together a shining future where we can wipe out racism and hatred and hunger and all of those kinds of things. Because you have to believe in a really strong optimism to be a post-millennialist as a Christian. You have to believe that this world will become a place that is almost what God wanted it to be.
That would be like a perfect world, and we can't have a perfect world because there's sin, there's no brokenness.
Exactly, and that's going to become evident even in chapter 20 again. But let me finish up by just talking for a minute about pre-millennialism. So we have amillennialism, which believes that the 1,000 years is just symbolic for this entire stretch between Jesus' two comings. And they come in both optimistic and pessimistic stripes. Some of them are optimistic, they believe things will get better, others are pessimistic. But what distinguishes them is that they don't believe that the millennium is a literal 1,000 years, and they don't believe that it will happen after Jesus' second coming. Okay, then we have the post-millennials that we just talked about. Then we have premillennial, and probably most of you in here are premillennial. That's my understanding of Scripture. Premillennial says that humanity will not get better. That in fact, demonic forces will continue to drive us toward destruction, and that Jesus' second coming will interrupt this pessimistic future. The Great Tribulation is the expression of that. You know, what do you do with the Great Tribulation if you're amillennialist or post-millennialist? There are things you can do with it, but it fits together so well with the idea of a premillennial position. So the premillennial position is pessimistic about the future, about the near future. Okay, and this argument becomes important. It may seem academic, but at the end of the day, what it does is it changes the way a lot of Christians approach the world. Because if you're post-millennial and you believe that this world will be a better place, then you're going to be pretty actively involved socially in changing the world because you believe it can be changed and that it will be changed. And you're fighting a winning battle. There was a book written at the end of the 19th century that really expressed this optimism well. Some of you may have read it. The title is In His Steps. Has anybody read that book, In His Steps? Okay, did you read that? Yeah, I read it a long time ago too. You might get it back out and just kind of flip through it. It is a perfect expression of postmillennialism, and it was right on time, because at the beginning of the 20th century, skepticism about traditional Christian doctrines was flourishing, and so people were looking for another expression of Christianity that they could hold on to. And people were saying, well, you know, maybe there isn't life after death. Maybe Jesus really didn't come back from the grave. Maybe there really aren't angels and demons and heaven and hell and God. But you know what? We can still make the world a better place. And we can use some sort of vestige of Christianity, sort of a hollowed out shell, I would say. And we can use that and these teachings about loving your neighbor and so forth. It doesn't matter that Jesus may not have been truly God, but we can embrace his teaching, the parts we like anyway, and make a better world. And so it was sort of a perfect storm, and it created what many of us call the liberal Christian church today, which is still very socially active, Nothing wrong with that, because Jesus certainly made the world a better place, and he told us that we need to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, and so forth. So here's the problem that we have to watch for, those of us who are pre-millennialists, is that we can become overly pessimistic about what is possible in this world. This is where the ultimate expression of the pessimistic premillennialist is the guy who buys a bunch of canned food and bottled water and digs a hole up on a hill somewhere and lines it with concrete and puts a metal door over it and hides from the world. Is that what Jesus called us to do? Absolutely not. You know, he said we're in the world but not of the world. He was realistic about what is possible in the world and about the reality of hatred and all these other things, hunger and so forth. But he said, you may not be able to stop hunger, but you can feed somebody who's hungry. And there's quite a distinction between those two things. Many of the massive projects that have been implemented to try to stop hunger have had very little effect, sometimes even negative effect. But when people just want to go out and help others who are in need, then we can make a difference in the life of somebody from the ground up, from the grassroots. That's more of a biblical Christianity. Now, the upside to being premillennial is that we take the Bible more seriously, more literally when we read these kinds of passages, whereas the postmillennial, especially the liberal Christian, has pretty much left the Bible behind at this point, other than certain passages about love. They would never have a discussion like we're having tonight. It just wouldn't happen. They left this, it's been jettisoned long, long ago. The book of Revelation has almost no meaning whatsoever because there's no concern about a prophetic future other than a humanistic future where maybe Christianity can work hand in hand with some other humanistic organizations to make the world a better place. All right, that was a lot of stuff. Okay, all right, let's stop and take a break here for a minute. Question?
So if we started at chapter 20, is this possibly another place where it's a flashback, reset?
That's what the amillennialists would say, that this is a recapitulation, but the premillennialists would say this is a real 1,000-year period. And so the question becomes, why would God do that?
Well, the reason I asked it is it starts talking about again about the nations and kings on thrones and things like that.
And not only that, it's going to talk about a war again, a large war with Gog and Magog.
Which, we just did that.
We did just do that. And so that's a really good question that I cannot answer tonight because I'm out of time. But that's where we're going. And those are the kinds of questions that we need to deal with in looking at these first few verses of chapter 20. So get it out and read it again. And if you're really brave, get on the internet and go to Google and put the word millennial in. And you'll go to all kinds of frontier lands, you know. Be careful. But sort of poke around and see what's out there. Try to get it settled in your mind what these three approaches are. And we'll discuss it a little bit more next Sunday night. Bring your questions back. My job is to try to make it clear for you. I want you to understand it. I want you to understand why you believe what you believe. All right, let's pray together. And we'll take a break before choir practice.